Imagine being stranded on a tiny, lifeless island. No trees, no shelter, no fresh water. Just an endless stretch of scorching sand in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Now imagine you're not alone. You're surrounded by over 200 shipwreck survivors. But the people who hold the power, the French sailors, see you as nothing more than cargo. This is the forgotten story of the Malagasy captives of 1761, left to fend for themselves on a desolate island where hope fades as fast as the tide. It all began in Madagascar, where European traders had long exploited the land and its people. Although France had officially banned slavery, the French East India Company was still running illegal operations, smuggling captives to plantations across the Indian Ocean. In July 1761, Captain Jean de Lafargue prepared his ship for one such mission. To the outside world, he was simply transporting goods. But deep below deck, 160 Malagasy men, women, and children sat in suffocating darkness, stolen from their homes, shackled in chains, and packed like cargo in a space barely fit for animals. Lafargue wasn't just ruthless, he was reckless. Instead of following the safe route, he decided to take a shortcut through poorly mapped waters to save time. His crew warned him the maps were unreliable, the ocean unpredictable, but he refused to listen. Then nature sent its own warning. Hundreds of seabirds filled the sky, circling the ship, an unmistakable sign that land was near. But Lafargue ignored them, and then disaster struck. A violent crash shook the ship. Wood-splintered crew members were thrown to the deck. Before they could react, a second crushing impact followed. L'Hotel had slammed into a hidden reef at full speed. Panic erupted. Sailors scrambled to secure lifeboats. But below deck, sheer terror took hold. The Malagasy captives, locked behind sealed hatches, screamed for help. No one came. The rising seawater swallowed their cries as they fought to escape their floating tomb. By dawn, the ship had been torn in half. Yet somehow, 123 French sailors and 88 Malagasy captives had survived. But they were not saved. They had washed up on a barren, unforgiving island, a place where the ocean would soon reveal that their true nightmare was only beginning. The survivors stumbled onto the shore, coughing up seawater, their bodies battered by the wreck. But as they looked around, a new kind of terror set in. There was nothing. No trees, no shade, no food, just an endless stretch of white sand surrounded by a sea that had already tried to kill them once. The island, no more than 1,700 meters long and 700 meters wide, was a graveyard waiting to happen. The French sailors, shaken but determined, immediately took charge. Their first priority, themselves. Among them was Lieutenant Castellan Duverne, an officer with a sharp mind and a survivalist instinct. He knew one thing for certain: if they didn't get off this island soon, they wouldn't last long. The officers wasted no time. They scavenged the wreck of L'Hotel, pulling out supplies, barrels of wine, salted meat, flour, and rationing them among the French crew. The Malagasy captives, they got nothing. Left exposed to the scorching sun and ruthless winds, the Malagasy survivors had to fend for themselves. No shelter, no water, no food. Yet they endured. They scavenged seabirds and their eggs, hunted sea turtles, and used what little remained of the wreck to craft makeshift tools. But survival wasn't the only thing on Castellan's mind. He had a plan. If no one was coming to save them, then they would have to save themselves. Using the remains of L'Hotel, Castellan and his men began working on a new boat. They salvaged wood, nails, sails, and rope. Every single piece of wreckage became a potential lifeline. At first, some of the Malagasy captives joined in. Maybe this boat would carry everyone to safety. But as the skeletal frame of the ship took shape, so did a horrifying truth. It wasn't built for everyone. It was built for the French. The officers had no intention of bringing the Malagasy captives with them. The divide was clear. The French had claimed the last hope of escape for themselves. A brutal reality set in: not everyone was getting off this island, and those left behind, they would be abandoned to die. Weeks passed. The island's brutal conditions broke the weak and tested the strong. The Malagasy captives, though exhausted and starving, refused to die quietly. They adapted, scavenging what they could, building makeshift shelters, and hunting whatever small creatures they could find. But the French hoarded the real supplies: flour, wine, salted meat, keeping it for themselves. Water was the worst of all. One day, the French discovered a shallow well of brackish water, a chance at survival, but they controlled it. The Malagasy captives were only allowed to drink after the French had taken their fill. Many died waiting for water that was never meant for them, and still the French worked on their escape. Under Lieutenant Castellan's orders, they turned the Shipwreck into salvation, piecing together a seaworthy vessel. They called it La Providence because, for them, it was a miracle. But it was a miracle built on betrayal. When the final planks were nailed and the boat was ready to launch, the Malagasy captives gathered, hoping, begging for space aboard. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. The French left without them. The officers and sailors climbed aboard, loaded their supplies, and set sail. As the wind filled their sails, they looked back one last time at the people they were leaving behind. Called out, "We will return for you." Then La Providence disappeared beyond the horizon, and the island fell silent. The Malagasy captives had been abandoned, stranded on a strip of sand in the middle of the ocean, with no way off, no food, no future. But they did not give up, because if the French wouldn't save them, they would save themselves. The Malagasy captives stood on the shore, watching the French ship disappear beyond the horizon. Then reality set in. They were alone, forgotten, left to die on a barren island with nothing but sand and the wreckage of a ship that had already betrayed them once. Days turned to weeks, then months. The sun burned their skin by day, and the relentless winds chilled them at night. The ocean taunted them, a vast, endless prison with no escape. But they refused to surrender. They moved inland, to the highest point of the island, searching for shelter. If no one was coming to save them, they had only one choice: to build, to endure, to survive. They dragged heavy slabs of beach, rock, and coral, constructing sturdy stone shelters that could withstand the brutal cyclones. Walls were built thick and strong, leaning against each other for support and protection. They were not just houses, they were fortresses against the elements. For food, they hunted seabirds, raided turtle nests, not a single child. Survived, hope should have died with them, but it didn't. For over a decade, the Malagasy captives endured, surviving against nature, time, and the impossible. And far across the ocean, one man had not forgotten them. Lieutenant Castellan still carried the weight of his broken promise, and he was about to make one final attempt to bring them home. For 14 years, the Malagasy survivors held on, waiting for a rescue that never came. But far across the ocean, Lieutenant Castellan never forgot them. He had promised to return, and that promise haunted him. Again and again, he pleaded with French authorities to send a rescue mission. But war had drained France's resources, and the response was always the same: they are already dead. Still, Castellan refused to give up. Finally, in 1775, 14 years after the wreck, France sent a ship to the island. But fate was cruel. As the rescue vessel approached, a violent storm struck, snapping the ship's anchor cable. The waves smashed the landing craft to pieces. The crew had no choice but to retreat, leaving one of their own sailors stranded on the island. Now, for the first time in 14 years, a Frenchman stood among the Malagasy captives, not as a commander, but as a fellow castaway. Months passed, no rescue came. With no other option, the sailor and 6 of the last Malagasy survivors built one final raft. They pushed off into the endless ocean and were never seen again. Then, in November 1776, 15 years after the shipwreck, another French ship appeared on the horizon. This time, there were no storms, no last-minute disasters. But what they found was not a thriving community of survivors. It was a ghost of what once was. Only 7 women and a single infant remained alive. For 15 years, they had kept a fire burning, waiting for a ship that never came. Their stone village still stood, a testament to their unbelievable resilience. The tools they had forged from the wreckage remained in place, untouched, waiting to be used once more. The French took them aboard. They were finally free. Authorities in Mauritius recognized them as free citizens, offering to return them to Madagascar, but the women refused. They had been stolen from their homeland once before, and they knew that if they returned, they would be enslaved again. So they stayed in the French colonies. Their fates lost to history. The island, once known as the Isle of Sand, was eventually forgotten. But in 2006, archaeologists rediscovered their village buried beneath time. The thick stone walls, the handcrafted tools, the signs of a desperate fight for survival, they were all still there, just as they had left them. The Malagasy captives of 1761 had been erased from history once before, but now their story will never be forgotten again.